Hello, my name is Paul Marchbanks, and this is Digging in the Dirt, with the third in a series on the films of Danish auteur Lars von Trier and a few of his Scandinavian precursors. On May 3rd, 1984, at the Danish premiere of his inaugural studio film, Lars von Trier handed out his first short manifesto on the current state of the film industry. In a barely veiled jab at the recent film and television work of Ingmar Bergman, von Trier declares that these, quote, hardened old men have lost the joy of making movies and need to depart the scene to make room for new and innovative filmmakers. Quote, we will no longer be satisfied with well-meaning films with a humanist message. We want more of the real thing, fascination, experience, childish and pure like all real art. We want to get back to the time when love between filmmaker and film was young, when you could see the joy of creation in every frame of a film. The element of crime, what von Trier called a modern film noir in color, constituted one antidote to what he saw as a tired, dreary profession, which is not to say that he didn't admit to the film's influences. In fact, at the outset of his career, he talks rather openly about all the films and pieces of literature that he appropriates in producing this dystopic tale. As Stig Bjorkman points out in an interview with von Trier, its post-apocalyptic flavor owes something to George Miller's early Mad Max films and John Carpenter's Escape from New York, to which list von Trier adds Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker and Ridley Scott's Blade Runner. Von Trier recognized that he was partaking in a fad, at the same time hoping, quote, that my stolen material has been processed into something new. The most important factor for me was to make a clean break from polished Danish filmmaking. I wanted a rough, patinated landscape, so we created one. I would argue that despite its numerous precursors, the element of crime does manage to surprise. For one thing, he and co-writer Niels Vorsel incorporate an eclectic collection of literary references for the sake of shaping tone, inserting the line, harry me, marry me, bury me, bite me, he replaces bind with bite, from James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, and, quote, water, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink, from Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which probably many of us read back in high school. He also allows the action to proceed without orchestrating emotion, a rather radical departure for a director, often dropping characters into particular scenes to use them as set dressing. He confesses that the entire film sprang from 3 images in his head, all involving the loud and incompetent police commissioner Kramer. 1, the discovery of a girl's corpse in a harbor. 2, the scene of another corpse in a foot-and-mouth disease pit. And 3, the gang ritual of jumping off a height with a rope tied around one leg. This was shot in the very early days of bungee jumping, and von Trier's characters use painfully inelastic cords when performing their ritual. The film becomes an abstract tapestry of disjunct set pieces, owing much to esoteric films like Vampire, a Gothic film by Carl Dreyer, one favored Scandinavian predecessor whom von Trier notably does not ever accuse of having lost a passion for filmmaking. The element of crime collects a series of striking, very wet images, including a few scenes shot in a derelict underground channel system, all of which signal a disintegrating, flooded world in which nature, quote, intrudes upon and somehow invades people's morals, end quote. Those are von Trier's words. Von Trier heightens a sense of disjunct unreality by recording no dialogue whatsoever on set, instead dubbing every single line in post-production. Again, instead of seeking emotionally realistic interactions among his characters, he focuses his attention on atmosphere. It helped that he shot this film noir, a storytelling mode which harkens back to a genre of film popular in the 40s and 50s, as if it were a pre-1930s silent film. Instead of recording live dialogue, that is, he blared classical music over loudspeakers to shape the actors' movements and energy, relying heavily on the opera of Richard Wagner, a personal favorite whose music will move into the foreground of the film's Melancholia and Nymphomaniac. Von Trier unsettles the audience further by avoiding the kind of panning shots and tilts that would help the viewer follow a character's action from one location to another, often editing together a series of fixed shots in a way that limits our understanding about each location visited by the characters. As much as he works to confuse his audience, however, certain thematic threads do appear regularly throughout the film, many tied to an ongoing quest for some meaningful moral rubric against which to measure human behavior. In 1987, the same year von Trier released the metafilm Epidemic, a movie about movie making, which manages to parody Christianity by way of a poorly trained and blasphemous priest, he touched briefly on his moral sensibilities in an interview. Though his parents had dismissed ethical absolutes as fiction throughout his childhood, he had since decided that, quote, they do exist. Not necessarily in the things I do, but they are important, end quote. Von Trier questions the moral character of his own work at this point in his career, but a decade later identifies the values which have always underpinned his stories. In the late 90s, he notes that, quote, religion and the miracle have, to a certain extent, been present in my films from the start, an idea he echoes when discussing the element of crime. Quote, I was brought up to believe that there was an explanation for everything. Absolute extremes like good and evil don't exist. Instead, there are things like mistakes and misunderstandings. Religion formed no part in my upbringing, and religion, of course, cherishes concepts like good and evil. Fisher, the film's protagonist, represents the humanists who's often had central roles in my films, and everything keeps going wrong for them. Fisher is working from the assumption that good and evil don't exist, but they're there, all right, in strength. The moral relativism of von Trier's parents left his teenage self searching for something he could not yet accept as real. In The Element of Crime, he reacts to his family's atheism by choreographing disaster for a secular humanist who, like his young self, had long dismissed moral binaries as fiction. In this early film, a tenacious and well-trained detective, Fisher, casts a wide net in efforts to find the killer mutilating girls in a modern European wasteland. Undaunted by the horror of Harry Gray's crimes, Fisher wades deep into the case, convinced that methodically reenacting Gray's preliminary actions will help him deconstruct the homicide's mind. Unfortunately for Fisher, his confidence fails to shield him from the evil he handles so freely. I won't spoil the ending. Suffice it to say that this evil infiltrates the presumptuous investigator's thoughts and culminates in an event he has since repressed, a buried memory reemerging only under hypnosis. The catalyst for the film's unexpected conclusion can be traced to its opening minutes, an early scene in which Fisher arrives in Germany to pick up a case that his university mentor and fellow criminologist, Osborne, has abandoned. The idealistic younger man tackles the problem with fervor, inspired by his teacher's published theory that modern crime can be charted since it resembles a chemical reaction. It, quote, can only happen in the right environment. This line of thinking holds that lawlessness is merely maladaptive behavior resulting from unruly external factors. Osborne, now a broken and haunted hermit, surprises Fisher by renouncing the very thinking that made his reputation years earlier. Shuffling about his crumbling home and sporadically inhaling medicinal fumes in an effort to ease his labored breathing, he mumbles, I wrote fiction. It wasn't science. What I wrote was naive, dangerous. The worst thing that can happen in the name of science is when the system becomes all-important. We always looked for the element of crime in the society, but why not look in the very nature of man? The former professor insists that a social science attentive only to the circumstances surrounding a crime overlooks important variables deep within the perpetrator. By identifying human nature instead of the mind as that element in which crime begins, Osborne reaches through both the cultural context and the individual psyche, straining to grasp some innate quality shared by the entire human race. Von Trier may not use the word sin here, but he appears to be circling the concept furiously. When Kim, a prostitute turned traveling companion, asks Fisher, quote, "Do you believe in good and bad? Can you make the bad good again?" The hypnotherapist, for whom Fisher is recounting all of this, laughs and asks, come, Mr. Fisher, did she really say that?" The psychologist's contemptuous dismissal of Kim's question exemplifies the incredulity of empirically minded modernists faced with such an old-fashioned inquiry into the roots of human behavior. Fisher, too, dismisses her words, leaving Kim to fall back on the tried and true mechanics of her profession. She, rather profanely, asks Fisher to, quote, "screw God into her," knowing that such an act will at least bring a reliable sensation. I'll leave it to you to decide what ideas the element of crime successfully inserts into the minds of its viewers, and to what degree what we take away from such an abstract film hinges on what we're looking for.